Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Inclusion Exchange. Thank you for joining us this afternoon as part of our Disability History Month celebrations. So, for those of you that don't know, Disability History Month ran from the 16th of November and lasts until the 16th of December. So, we're really pleased to have a session specifically looking at disability and particularly disability in the workplace. And the title for today's session is all around no limits and how organisations can narrow the disability employment gap. So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Io Barley and I'm the Managing Director and Senior EDI Consultant at Bakary Barley. We are an organisation that helps people within the workplace to build strategies to be more inclusive. And we do that through providing strategic advice, but also learning and development across all protected characteristics so that people within the workplace really benefit from an inclusive culture and have the opportunity to break through barriers that might be there through to systematic inequalities. So we're really pleased to be here today on our podcast. This is the Inclusion Exchange. So this is part of our free offering really to the EDI community and beyond for people who want to learn more about how they can develop best practice within their organisations, but also reflect on what they can do individually and personally to be more inclusive. So if you're not aware already, we do these podcasts quite regularly. This is the last one of the year, but there'll be more in 2023. And if you would like to visit our website to find out more, please do. There's a link in the chat. And we also put out a fortnightly thought leadership newsletter as well, so that we provide practical tips on what you can do to make your workplace more inclusive. So that's a bit about us. Really excited to have our guest speaker today. She's called Anoushe Husain. She will be coming online in just a sec, but as means of an introduction, I just wanted to give you a few pointers in terms of who Anoushe is before she joins us on the podcast. So Anoushe is a champion for all people who experience barriers and self-limiting beliefs. She was born with her right missing below the elbow and lives with multiple health conditions. She's a cancer survivor, she's a Muslim, and she comes from an ethnic minority background. And Anoushe has never let what society or culture thinks of her limit her or dictate the direction of her life. And she constantly breaks the mold and challenges not only her own beliefs, but also the potential that is provided to her in society and through her own culture as well. So she's a really inspirational speaker. We've actually found out just recently that she's been at 14 speaking events just this month and at 2 award ceremonies. So she's very much an esteemed speaker, and we're really pleased to have her share not only a bit about her life story, but also what she does within organisations with us today. She's really become a role model for anyone facing self-limiting beliefs or barriers, and she'll be sharing her story to help others unlock their potential. Now, by day, Anoushe is a civil servant. She's an equality and diversity practitioner, but she's also a paraclimber in the UK and the ambassador for both Ehlers-Danlos Support UK and Limbpower, which is the leading charity for amputees and those with limb difference. She's also co-founded and runs Paraclimbing London, and she competes as an international paraclimber, and I believe she does that with her partner, which is really exciting as well. So Anoushe has won multiple awards, including being in the 2019 and the 2022 Power List, which acknowledges people with disabilities in the UK. And she's also a Guinness World Record title holder. So really pleased to have Anoushe with us today. Anoushe, come on board and join us. It'd be great to see your face. Brilliant.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being with us. How are you today? You okay?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Good. And better to have you on board. Definitely. Just astounded really by some of that information in the bio in terms of what you're doing now and what you've achieved, even in the last few years, really, in terms of your public speaking, but from a sporting perspective. So what I'd love to do first is just ask you a little bit about how you got to where you are. I'd love to know about your origin story and kind of, how you got here and why you decided to do what you do as well.
Yeah, so I guess it's almost a typical origin story in the sense of I was born with my right arm missing below the elbow, and my parents, it was kind of a surprise. My parents had no idea what was going to happen. I just popped out and there I was. And culturally, I have a Pakistani heritage, and at the time, 35 years ago, disability was very much so seen as physical disability equated intellectual disability or learning disability. So my parents were told I wouldn't attend mainstream school, I'd never drive, I'd never attain in life, all of the stuff that comes with the typical stigma that was held back in the day of disability. So they got in touch with a charity in the UK. I grew up in Luxembourg, but they'd been living in the UK prior to that, and sort of got in touch with this charity called Reach and said, help, we don't know what to do. And they were like, look, you support her, she'll attain. So they did. I was making cookies at the age of 2 because I had clumsiness and balance issues. And so my mom was very much so keen on getting me as independent as possible, because they were very aware that even if they gave me the supportive bubble that I'd have at home, I'd be facing stigma and judgment outside of the home all the time. Constantly people saying, oh, we can't do this and you can't do that. And they were essentially preparing me for that life. And I had a relatively smooth life until I reached my teens. I was a competitive martial artist. And I arrived at a competition at the age of 12 and get told I can't attend because I'm missing my right arm. Now, the decision about this had only been made the night before. And I'd come to the competition with family friends without my parents. And suddenly I was faced with the fact that I was ready to go for my first regional competition. And I got told, you can't do it because of your arm. In essence, people had made a decision about my capabilities and my potential without consulting me and without letting me even try. It wasn't even like a tokenistic, let the disabled person do her thing and feel happy about herself. No, not even letting her try. And that was a fundamental change in how I saw life, because even though I couldn't label it as discrimination back then or as stigma and judgment, ultimately it set off something within myself, which was, why are we judging people? Why are we stigmatizing people because of who they are, right? I didn't choose to have 1.5 arms. I love my little arm, but I didn't choose that. I didn't choose to be different. And honestly, different is kind of cool. Normal is kind of overrated. But at the same time, nobody chooses the color of their skin. Nobody chooses their sexual orientation, their gender identity, where they're born, who they're born to, the socioeconomic background. None of that is something we can choose, right? Which means, why are we judging people for things they are rather than what they choose to be as a consequence? Why aren't we helping people rather than judging people because of the fact that they're different to a perceived normality? And so it's that essentially drove me to who I am today. I've always wanted to be a public servant. Originally wanted to be a diplomat for the United Nations, but health took a turn, so traveling around didn't really work. So I decided to become a civil servant, and eventually I've moved into diversity and inclusion practitioning, which actually works really well with fundamentally the beliefs I hold of people shouldn't be limited by who they are at all. We shouldn't limit people based on who they are. And ultimately, a lot of self-limiting beliefs are simply held because of what people are told. So many of my beliefs of I can't do this are held because somebody has told me at some point I can't do that. Or I've seen on the media that people like me aren't on TV. Or I've seen somewhere else that isn't the case. I just decided to turn that around on its head and go, well, I'm there. And if I'm there, hopefully loads of other people will be there too. And if I start sharing my life and talking about the challenges I experience and the barriers that I've experienced, maybe it will help other people realize that they're holding those beliefs in themselves. And so much of it is ingrained by what society tells us. And essentially that's why I am who I am today.
Thank you. That's such an interesting history. And I'm curious to know particularly when that happened at the tournament or the competition where you were turned away, I suppose what impact that had on you at that stage. And also, how do people kind of react to the fact that, you have this vision around the fact that you can break through the barriers? Because surely if there's an individual on the other end of it, it's almost challenging their norm. So I just wondered what type of reaction you get as well when you have these types of discussions and people see actually it's them that have got the issue, not necessarily, it's not an issue in terms of ability from your perspective.
Yeah, so I guess when it came to the little 12-year-old, she was heartbroken, definitely. And the other problem was, for the next 3 years in martial arts, my coaches refused to teach me. So I'd be standing there, they'd teach the person to my left and correct them, teach the person to my right and ignore me. Because to them, I no longer had the potential of competition. Therefore, I was no longer worth teaching. It all got turned around, thankfully, with a coach who realized what was going on and got me back into competitions. And I lost in my first competition. And whilst everybody else was really sad I lost, I was really happy because I got to try. I got to be normal. I got to be included. But also, I lost to the champion of Switzerland. I mean, heck, that's not a bad loss in my first round. So I wasn't displeased at all because I lost to somebody who was absolutely phenomenal. So yeah, I think people do react really oddly to what I say because obviously I'm challenging the norm, but equally the norm is wrong, right? People shouldn't be limited by how they are born or who they are born to. They just shouldn't be, because ultimately we're limiting people to a label made by a society that is not centered or catered to them in the first place, right? And even worse for people who are intersectional. So even worse when you add in cultural issues, when you add in skin color, all of that, it makes it even harder for those people. So why are we listening to that rhetoric? And that's what I'm trying to challenge. Why are we listening to that rhetoric and limiting ourselves? And why aren't we pushing back on those society's expectations? And why aren't we changing that norm?
Absolutely. And I suppose in terms of your growth, obviously from being a young person and having your experiences to actually being obviously an adult and being an EDI practitioner, have you seen much of a shift in terms of the way people view disability? I wrote a blog recently around kind of me reflecting back 15 years ago, learning about the different models of disability, the social model, the medical model, seeing disability or the person with a disability as the issue, as opposed to seeing the society, which is actually structured in a way that's not inclusive and that disables people. So I just wondered, have you seen any change from when you look back to when you were a young person? Do you feel that it's moved on at all?
I think it has, definitely. So, I mean, we no longer necessarily equate physical disability with intellectual disability. And I think that is a big shift. I grew up in the medical model of disability. Luxembourg still employs that model, whereas in the UK, it's the social model of disability. So I had to adapt myself to a new model when I moved to the UK nearly 10 years ago. We don't use disability words anymore to describe people and insult people with in the same ways we did. And I'm not using those words because they're incredibly offensive to use them. But we have moved away from that in a certain way. We are slowly moving away from ability washing words. So for instance, differently abled is a term that's definitely less accepted today than it was back in the day. It's seen as a way of making disability sound nice by the disabled community. That being said, I used to use differently able, and if somebody uses that to help themselves accept a disability, I'm not going to judge them because I know it helped me. So I think we are moving. But that being said, I was born with a visible disability, live with chronic illnesses where I definitely received judgment because people would be like, hey, you look okay, even if I didn't feel okay. And now I'm an ambulant wheelchair user and I'm encountering all the physical barriers of not being able to access places. I'd say we still have a long way to go because it is very hard traveling around places or getting into a shop or navigating a shop or frankly anything. It's just hard.
We were talking, I think we were talking a few weeks ago around the time of the Queen's funeral and something as monumentous, I suppose, around that and various different events that people actually, unfortunately, might have been excluded in terms of being able to participate in that type of activity. Exactly. I don't know if you want to say a bit more about that to provide the context.
Well, I mean, it's just as an ambulant wheelchair user, like the problem was there was a separate queue at the Queen's funeral. And I think they did a really good job doing that. But the problem is what they did was they created time slots. So you could turn up, but then you'd get a time slot, which could have been 5, 10, 20 hours later, which meant you had to come back and travel. It meant you didn't have to wait, which is great, but it meant you had to come back and travel. And that's not always feasible generally when you have train strikes going on, it's always not feasible anyway. But then you add in the additional part of maybe having to wait through the night as a disabled person. I get really cold in my wheelchair because I'm seated. So the thing is, like, I get really cold. I have temperature control problems now, and a lot of disabled people in wheelchairs will have that same problem. But a lot of people who are ambulant and chronically ill will also have issues around standing for long times, just not being in a comfort zone. And so it was definitely hard because I really wanted to go, and then ultimately made the decision not to because I couldn't really sacrifice the rest of my week to go down and make that decision to stay there for maybe 10 hours in a row or something, and worrying about how I was going to charge up my chair if it ran out of battery and all the practical things that come with it. And it's the same with going around. I mean, how many times has my husband been talked to instead of me, despite the fact that I'm the one who can absolutely speak without a problem? That's routine, probably happens at least once a week. Last week, I was taking the tube to go to an event, and it's a step-free station, but the gap was a good half a meter between the train and the platforms. I couldn't actually get off at that station, and I had to panic looking for the next step-free station available, and come into work half an hour later than predicted because that's where I got lost on the tube. Spontaneous journeys are a lot less possible now that I'm an ambulant wheelchair user, because I never know what step-free means.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in there in terms of, I suppose, additional challenges, additional things, and the energy it must take to think through doing something that's quite simple. So what effect does that have on you day to day then, in terms of your ability to do what you want to do? Do you feel that there's a lot of restrictions currently on what you can do?
Yeah, a lot more. I mean, less than there were in 2020 when I started becoming a wheelchair user, because I've now got a chair that's more suited to my needs and things like that. But, you know, you've got to remember, you've got to charge up the chair, you've got to wear clothes that work for you, you've got to be able to carry everything just in case you need to layer up. You know, my headscarf needs to be tied in a certain way to make sure I don't like strangled in the wheels, which has happened a couple of times. I've got to make sure that, you know, the journey I'm taking, am I planning to do any shopping? Do I have the right bag with me to do that? If I'm carrying a little suitcase on the back of my chair, then I can't take public transport because it won't fit. It's a cacophony. It's just hectic. It means I don't go out nearly as often as I used to. I don't go out to places I don't know yet. Or when I do, the amount of time I spend on Google Maps is hilarious compared to what I used to. So yeah, there's a lot more anxiety around getting out now. Even my standard commute to work is still driving me anxious.
Wow. Yeah, no, useful to know. And I suppose in terms of moving society on in this area, is having that insight and understanding of those barriers that still exist now. And I know it's Disability History Month, so there's a lot to learn in terms of the historic struggles, going from kind of nothing about us without us, in terms of historic campaigns that actually led to the first disability legislation. So we do have a history in the UK of acknowledging that there are barriers to employment, to housing, to education for people with disabilities, but obviously still there's what I'm hearing is there's still a long road ahead in terms of
Absolutely.
how everyone in society can just be a bit more cognizant and aware of it. So one thing that we generally talk about on this podcast, I suppose, is what employers can do. So this episode is themed really about the employment gap. So we know that I think Scope said quite recently that 1 in 4 people at working age has a disability. But a lot of the work that I do with clients actually identifies that in their workforce, they're only generally maybe aware of 3% of the workforce who actually kind of declare that they have a disability. So I just wondered, from your perspective, if you've got any reflections on that, on kind of the disparity, on the employment gap, why you feel that is still such a current issue in the UK.
So it's not only 1 in 4, even 1 in 5, depending on which statistic you look at. It's actually 83% of those are acquired disabilities, which is interesting, which means somebody somewhere has had a lifestyle change or a life transformation during their lives, potentially traumatic one as well. So I think it's worth acknowledging that, because obviously that can come at any age. And the employment gap gets bigger once you're over 50. And the other thing to note is actually, though often disabled people will be employed in lower paid jobs, in education, in public sector, or in retail are the main 4, or independent, so self-employed. I think some of the stuff around that is just, if we thought if we thought accessible and inclusive by default. So whenever you're thinking about a policy or something, are we thinking, is it inclusive by default? So is it screen reader friendly? Basics. Screen reader friendly. Does it read easily? Are we avoiding the jargon? Things like that. But then also, you have disabled people in your workforce. Ask them what they would like to see in work in terms of improving things and in terms of making things easier. Do you have a workplace adjustments passport or a workplace adjustments policy? And do you have examples of workplace adjustments in that? So the reason I say put examples in is because when I joined the civil service in the UK, I used to be working in Luxembourg, so I worked in various institutions before joining. But the concept of a reasonable adjustment or a workplace adjustment was completely foreign to me when I moved to the UK. And I didn't actually ask for one because I didn't know to ask for one until about 9 months in to working. I needed them, but I had no idea how to ask for them. I didn't know they existed. And then when I did find out about the policy, I didn't know what to ask for. And often people who are new to disability or new to changing needs will not know what to ask for because they don't know. So if you can give them examples, tangible examples of what you can do, then that can help them then voice their needs in a much more intelligent way. And there are hard adjustments like a mouse, a keyboard, a fixed desk, a high adjustable desk, etc., etc. But soft adjustments like maybe starting the day slightly later, maybe flexing hours, maybe allowing for hospital time, maybe changing sickness triggers, depending on what the person needs. And then trialing those adjustments. You don't have to fix them down straight away, especially if you're worried about that. Then trial them out, because actually sometimes you can try one out and find it doesn't actually quite suit the person anyway, or suit the business need. So I think those are really practical, tangible things we can do. Do you have a disability network? If you don't, why don't you see whether one can start up? You say 3% of people are declaring that they have a disability. I reckon declaration rates are really low because people are really uncomfortable declaring still. And part of that is also because people still struggle with the word disability, especially if they might be neurodiverse or chronically ill, but not technically qualifying under the Equality Act, because the Equality Act is quite strict about what a disability under the Equality Act is in terms of what classifies. So some people will consider themselves disabled, but because they're not under the Equality Act, they might not tick that box. So it's about making those people feel welcome too. And when you're putting out blogs or things, being really wide ranging. So for instance, in Paraclimbing London, what we do is we say anybody with a disability, long-term illness, invisible or less visible condition, mental health, including cancer. So we kind of cover everybody in one shot. But we also say in Paraclimbing London that your disability or whatever can impact you in your climbing life or your real life. So the idea being is people are self-identifying at that point and however they feel comfortable. And that way we get people who really wouldn't qualify under the Equality Act and technically in work would never qualify for adjustments. But yeah, they have something that's disabling them and they would benefit from the peer support that comes with that. So it's about using words better, thinking about how we can do that. And then it's also about considering things like, what are the barriers? Why aren't you attracting people? What is making people feel less confident, less safe? Do you have role models, people talking about disability, leaders, allies? So I've thrown out so many things in those last few minutes.
No, that's useful. I think those practical tips are really, really useful in terms of things that we can do. Because I know that when it comes to reasonable adjustments, for instance, I think that some can feel a bit cautious in terms of implementing them because they feel actually this can be really expensive, it's not going to be workable. But actually, when you look into the detail, is that a myth? And do we actually need to kind of bust that myth really in terms of the fact that we can make small adjustments that make a big difference in terms of people's ability to actually do their job effectively?
Most
and I think that
are small.
you speak to people, right? So it's almost like challenging, like you said at the beginning, that rhetoric, that belief that actually there's a limit here. That actually there's a limit here that's almost self-imposed, that we're self-imposing on ourselves and others within the workplace. So I think those practical solutions are really, really important. I wonder if there's anything, because you've mentioned a little bit about your background, obviously being from an ethnic minority background and a Muslim. Is there anything that employers you think should be aware of in terms of that intersectionality, the difference that people experience based on multiple parts of their identity? And what's your experience personally been? Has there been a difference for you?
I think there is. So in particular around the caution around declaring a disability in particular, I think people from intersectional backgrounds for the most part are more cautious. There is a wariness about not being believed, and that's linked to UK disability history as well. When you look at legislation, when you look at movements, Black disabled movements didn't really start until the 1990s. Same with LGBT plus disabled movements. They didn't really kick off until then, which meant, if you think about it, they didn't really have that same voice that, other disabled movements have had for 100 plus years now. So I think there's a little bit of that where people are still finding their space sometimes. There is also the fact that, so when you're trying to declare a disability, and especially when you're talking about the concept of reasonableness, now I know from personal experience as somebody who's chronically ill and who needs most of my adjustments due to chronic illness and not my arm being a very tangible and easy to believe, hey, I'm missing an arm, you can't make, that's obvious. Very hard to explain the impact of the other conditions I have, even post-cancer issues that I still live with, because people can't see it. And I look okay, and I speak okay, and I seem okay, which means it's hard for people to understand that when I'm not with my office face or my work face, actually, I'm a completely different person. And the amount of energy taken to do that is actually quite high, but that doesn't mean the impact of my disabilities is anything less. And it doesn't mean I don't need those adjustments. And then you add in the concept of reasonable adjustment. That's why in my workplace, we've changed the terminology to workplace adjustment. We've taken the word reasonable out. Reasonable is still there when it comes to the agreeing process and thinking process of an adjustment. It still needs to be reasonable according to the law, yes. But what we've done is taken out that judgment of reasonable, because how often the disabled person, and particularly the intersectionally disabled person, will ask themselves, what is reasonable? Is it reasonable for me to even ask for the adjustment? Often when it comes to women, often when it comes to ethnic minority staff, because they are already questioning their validity of their disability. They're often not believed. We already know the statistics of medical care when it comes to ethnic minority colleagues and people in the UK, in the NHS. Look at the statistics around Black women giving birth, for instance, recently. We already know that ethnic minority people are believed less in the medical environment. Their pain is treated less well in the medical environment. Often medications and research is done less to those people, right? We know that when it comes to clinical trials, which means there is still a systematic issue going on, which means when it comes to the office space, it is still transferring there as well. There is still this internal need to validate yourself, which means it's very hard to then, it's seriously brave for anybody to come up to their line manager to go, hey, I need help. Add the historical issues of imposter syndrome and wider systemic and issues, it's even braver, which means you need to believe them.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the whole masking parts of our identity to prevent any discrimination is really weathering and has a massive impact on well-being. I know the theme for this month's celebrations is around kind of disability, but also well-being and improving well-being for people with disabilities as well, because that impact must be significant day to day, thinking about what your interactions are going to be with different people, how you're going to be treated. But not only that, if you've got a disability where you need accessibility requirements, that's an additional layer of thought that goes into your everyday. So that's useful to know. So useful to get your perspective on intersectionality. I wonder, in terms of, again, when you've gone through particularly challenging times yourself or had barriers yourself within the workplace, what type of networks or, I don't know, what type of support is there out there really in terms of where you can go for more advice or to find out about other people who've perhaps been through similar situations?
So to start with, if you have a staff network, then that's amazing because you get the peer support of talking to other colleagues, or a trade union. I would always say if your workplace happens to have unions, they're always a good resource of advice to go to. Then Disability Rights UK, fantastic resource because they really are on top of the legislation, and they have loads of handbooks on current law and best practice and recent case law, which means if you do need to sort of do anything a bit more deep, especially if you're applying for benefits and things like that, like personal independence payment, or looking to start jumping through those hoops, then they can be a really valuable resource to just take away some of the fear around what's going to happen next, but also give you all the tools you might need to get yourself through that process, because it can be really daunting. Your local council, but also equally disability groups, Scope, Shore Trust, like charities. Most chronic conditions and disabilities will have their own specific charity. Get in touch with them as well, because they often will have their own support networks. I'm part of multiple support networks for each of my individual disabilities. actually. And I only go into them because it can be really overwhelming reading it all. So I only go into them when I really need something or when I feel like I want to help out. But it's good to know that I have like an anonymous space where I can just ask something, either with my name or without my name. And I can ask that question and feel safe in knowing that I can probably get an answer or at least some advice on what to do next.
Yeah, I think that's useful. I think having external networks is really important, as well as having kind of staff networks. And I think it'd be great to learn a bit more from you around kind of how workplaces in particular can create, I suppose, a psychological safety around having these discussions. Because I think you mentioned in terms of your reflections on the low declaration rate, particularly within the workplace, and that may well be because people don't necessarily feel safe to do so. They might not be 100% confident that they're going to be treated in an equitable way. How do you think, I suppose the question is, how do you think you go about creating that psychological safety within a workplace? But also, if the workplace isn't quite there yet and doesn't feel safe, how they can go about making that improvement, really? Because I think, particularly within race equality, we talk a lot about kind of bringing your full self to work, and in a way that's really positive, but it's also problematic if we expect people to do that in a context that's not yet quite there yet. So I just wondered if you had any reflections on what to do as an individual if your organisation isn't quite there yet.
So I heard a talk earlier this month about not bringing your full self to work, but bringing the parts of you that you want to. And I thought that was more appropriate, actually, especially when it comes to ethnicity or disability, because actually there are bits of us we don't want to bring into work. And there are bits of us we choose not to. And the bits of us we really, really just want to escape from, right? So I'm like, I kind of like the concept of bringing the parts of me that I want to and the parts of me that I need to bring in. So it might be not something I want to, but it is something I need to because I have to have that conversation, for instance, with my line manager about how bad things are going, for instance, in terms of the disability world. So I think that's really important, that people should feel safe to bring what they want to and what they need to. If you are in a workplace environment where maybe your declaration rates are really low, then I think it's first of all explaining why it's important to have that declaration rate go up, right? Because why that data is useful, why it's needed, because it's the bread and butter for all HR practitioners. And ultimately, if we don't have the data, we can't know who we're catering to. So that's one. And we can't spot where we're having problems, right? We need that quantitative data. Just makes it a factual argument and takes the emotion out of it, which I think is really, really important. The next is defining what disability means, because often people don't want to declare because they don't actually know what it means, right? So tell them what you mean by disability. Like, is it the definition under the Equality Act? Is it wider than that? Are neurodiverse people allowed to call themselves disabled even if they don't like the word? Can they use prefer not to say if they want to? And I really encourage people to at least say prefer not to say no or yes rather than not declaring at all. Because not declaring at all means we don't know. But at least with prefer not to say, we have some sort of engagement. And it's the first step towards getting them towards yes or no. And prefer not to say might actually be often a neurodiverse colleague or somebody who it considers themselves disabled but doesn't want to use the word disabled yet. For instance, somebody with high blood pressure, but it doesn't actually impact them on a day-to-day basis. They're living with a long-term illness technically, but are they disabled if it's not impacting them? Not under the Equality Act, yet they could still click yes, and I would have no issues with them clicking yes on the thing because it will potentially impact them in the long term. We've also got to remember, as I said, 83% of those with disabilities have acquired them during their lives, right? Which means you might be having to get somebody to try and shift their no to a yes in a traumatic time. So it's about being soft and empathetic around that language and understanding that even bringing this up could be traumatic for some people. If you have mental health first aiders, an employee assistance program, a safe place where people can reach out. We do virtual surgeries in our workplace. So it's a one-on-one where people can just drop in and come with any concern they want to the EDI team. And the idea being that it's a safe place for people to talk. And we will escalate what we need to if needs be. But the whole thing is that they have a safe place to speak to, just in case we're bringing up something that is a bit traumatic. Chatham House rules. The idea being that when that conversation happens, nothing leaves that conversation without the explicit consent of the person who's speaking. There's so many ways to make an environment safe. Even if the whole institution or organization doesn't feel safe yet, you can create pockets of safety with very clear rules around what is expected in that.
Absolutely. Yeah, again, lots of practical advice there in terms of what can be done. And it's it's acknowledging that there's a lot more work to be done in this area, and it takes that intentional focus on it really to make that improvement.
It's cultural change ultimately, and culture takes time. And organizations aren't going to get it right in the first time, most likely. And when you do get things wrong, that's okay, because you're learning. And like around the conversations around Black Lives Matters and things like that, a lot of people were learning and a lot of people got it wrong. And a lot of people are still learning, and terminology and things are still moving as society keeps moving on. So like, it's okay to get it wrong, learn from it, apologize, and do it better the next time around then. But be kind to yourself as well. Don't like stop just because you got it wrong the first time or the second or the third. Keep going.
Definitely. Absolutely. So interested to get your perspective. So when we speak to a lot of people, particularly around gender and race, the issue of representation, particularly in senior leadership, comes up quite a lot. And we've talked a little bit already about some of the practical things we can do around recruitment for people with disabilities. And there's a lot of kind of reasonable adjustments that could be made around, providing interview questions to everyone in advance and enabling people to kind of do a bit of a recce of the interview premises before. So there's lots of different examples of things you can do around recruitment. We're just curious to get your views, particularly around kind of progression, things that you might have seen around barriers that specifically exist for people with disabilities around progression. Because I know, again, when it comes to declaration, particularly in senior leadership teams, often I speak to organisations that don't seem to have much, if any, representation of people who've declared a disability. So is that important to have representation at the highest levels? And what are the kind of barriers that you think of people who actually get into employment but are struggling to kind of get to the next stage in their career?
So I think representation is important. I think we suffer from some stigma at senior levels and some low declaration rates in particular. Because as I said, if 83% of disabilities are acquired, and on the expectation that once you reach senior leadership, you are slightly older than you were when you started in an organization, then you're most likely going to have acquired your disability at that point, or if not slightly earlier, or at some point in your career, which means we likely have more senior leaders who are disabled than they are actually declaring. That's my thought on that. And that is based on some actual quantitative stuff that happened in the civil service, where we had people declare and suddenly we reached our targets because actually we had the people in there, they just hadn't declared. So again, not in every organization, definitely, but I definitely think we do have more disabled people who are definitely not declaring than we do. I think it's also important they talk about it. I think the fact that they don't declare is a big thing. It means that they're not feeling psychologically safe to deal with it. It means they're not feeling confident enough to be role models. Maybe they're not feeling equipped enough to be role models. So it's about creating a senior leadership capability on that, how to have those conversations, how to deal with it in an empathetic way, how to role model, how to ally, and also how to take care of yourself in the process. Because especially when it comes to an acquired disability, it's a very different process than somebody who's born. Me, my right arm, I never lost it. I never had to go through a traumatic experience of an amputation. It's a very different experience to somebody who's had an amputation, right? So, and I'm very aware of that. And I suspect for those who have acquired disabilities, I know when it came to my invisible illnesses or the fact that I became a wheelchair user, there was definitely a grieving process that went around that. So that is something that people need to be okay with in themselves before they're ready to ally and role model, right? Because if they can't do it themselves, they can't go through the process themselves, and how are they expected to then help others? You can't pour from an empty bucket. So I think there's that. In terms of middle levels and lower level management or entry level positions, to try and build that pipeline and get people in, and then also get people to progress. Often you have the problem of balancing things. So for instance, I have between sort of on average 65, 70 hospital appointments a year. Thankfully, in a post-COVID environment, most of them are done on the phone now. So it gives me the flexibility of being in the office and grabbing a small meeting room if I'm in the office on that given day. But also I need the processing time around them to make sure I have the space to then return to a work meeting, especially if I'm dealing with a difficult conversation. So that's to be considered if you are, dealing with colleagues who might have to juggle that type of environment where they are actually in and out of hospitals or in and out of appointments all the time. How are they going to then manage maintaining the performance and then taking on the expectations of progressing, especially if you're going to put them on a talent program or things like that. So it's about letting them lead and letting them identify and helping them identify the barriers that they have progression, and also asking them whether they want to progress. And if they don't, what are the reasons they don't want to, and how many of those reasons are self-limiting beliefs that they don't think they can versus they actually can't. So I think there's a lot of that going on. And it's about understanding that there might need to be some more flexibility for those colleagues in terms of how they progress, maybe moving to slightly more part-time work, maybe more flexible working, things like that. Maybe giving them some more opportunities to test out their skills at a higher level without being at a higher level, just to see how they cope. So for instance, the role I'm in right now is it's very much so middle between two grades. And the reason I picked this role was so I could have a really good feel of what it's like operating at a higher level while being at the lower level, so that I can just test to see whether I could do it. And I deliberately made that career choice, whereas people without a disability might not have made that career choice. But I did it to make sure I could cope with the next level up. And yeah, I'm okay with that decision because it means I'm now sure I can do it. But I actually did it before I got this role. I got put on a talent program where I operated at a higher level for a year and tested my wings out before I went off and got a promotion. So that's a really useful tool of being able to just help people, maybe give them a project where they're doing 1 day a week, or, you know, maybe a month's worth of something where they're working at that higher level and what is expected of them, and sort of trial out and understand what those barriers might be.
Thank you. Again, really practical things that might not spring to mind automatically, in terms of actually doing that would actually open up a whole heap of opportunities, not only for the individual who has disabilities, but actually if we looked at that in a broader sense as well, it'd be just a helpful way to kind of look at things. Again, removing that limit, removing that kind of artificial barrier or structure, and unpicking it to see actually, do we have to do it the traditional way? Does doing it in a different way actually open up the floodgates to support a number of different people, not just kind of an atypical type within the workplace? So really, really good to hear that. And that kind of leads to my next question. And by the way, for those listening, if you do have a question for Anoushe, please do post it in the chat. She'd love to answer it, I'm sure. But my question really is around other positive initiatives, I suppose, that you've practically seen the organisations are doing that we can learn from, really, around being more accessible to everyone. Yeah, if you've got anything to share on that, it'd be really fascinating to hear.
Reverse mentoring, I think, is fantastic. Open it to all protected characteristics and all grades and all non-protected characteristics, anybody who's different, whatever their difference is. I think it's fantastic as an initiative because it creates those conversations with senior leaders who aren't necessarily exposed to people who are different to themselves, neither in their workplace environment nor in their social circles. And it teaches them to listen with empathy, and it might change how they do things. So I think that's a great thing to do. And the other one is actually just mentoring generally. How often is, or mentoring or coaching for essentially for those with disabilities, but also from ethnic minorities or anybody actually who's struggling to make that progression because of maybe self-limiting beliefs or societal issues. So if we have mentors, then those people can help act as a checks and balances, right? To say, hey, you believe that, but actually that's not true. You believe that of yourself. You believe that society believes that of you. No, that's not true. You know, you can be who you want to be. You just need the right tools to enable that to happen. Also, conversational toolkits. So things to help people. So I just realized the sun is really bright. There we go. It's blinding me slightly. So conversational toolkits around how to help people have conversations, because Scope had a really good study saying 9 out of 10 interactions for disabled people so 9 out of 10 disabled people will receive one negative interaction a week, right? And I can't remember, there was a previous study, and it was a really high number of people who, despite the fact that they knew somebody with a disability, were still uncomfortable talking to people with disabilities. It was incredible, the number. It was shocking. And I just went, well, to me, that wasn't surprising, but it's sad to see how high that number is. And that's despite the fact that 1 in 5, 1 in 4 has a disability in the UK, right? That effect means 1 in 5 people, everybody probably knows somebody with a disability or somebody who's caring for somebody with a disability, right? We all know somebody at some point in our lives, we will know. So, and with 1 in 2 of us due to have cancer at some point in our lifetimes, and cancer being qualified as a disability automatically under the Equality Act, then that means basically everybody, right? We'll know somebody somewhere with something going on. Yet how are we still so uncomfortable having conversations around disability then? Why is this still a thing? So create toolkits around conversations, how to have a conversation, how to build that, So when it comes to a line manager trying to have that conversation with a staff member, or a staff member having that conversation with a line manager or wider, they just have a little map to follow. And it just, again, takes away the emotion. Workplace adjustments passports, again, take the emotion out of, when somebody needs to change a job. When I change a job, it's really easy. I have a passport, hand it to my line manager. Don't have to have the conversation anymore about what the disabilities are or how I got them or why I got them or the trauma around it. No, boom, here, have my passport. These are the adjustments I have. Are you happy with these adjustments? Fine. Do we need to tweak them? Okay, done. Means I don't have to do the emotional labor.
Yeah. So why do you think that so many organisations are not doing that, if that's the case, if I'm so bold to say that? So there's pockets of good practice, absolutely, that I've seen. But why do you think the majority aren't doing these things? Is it around education? Is it around fear of cost? What do you think the main barriers are that stop organisations from looking at this seriously and making those changes?
I think it's fear of cost. You still have that stigma and perception that disabled people are a burden, aren't going to be reliable. You still have that because, if you don't put the things in place for them, they aren't going to be reliable. They aren't going to perform to their best of the ability. But that's not because they can't. That's because we still are living in a social model of disability where barriers still exist for them to perform at the best of their ability. That's the reality. So it's not about the fact that they can't. It's about the fact that they're not given the right tools to perform, which is further creating that negative cycle around their employability and their ability to progress. And disability is still very much so, I still feel very othered, especially now that I'm a wheelchair user. I already felt othered as somebody with less visible conditions because people will go, oh, you're too young to be ill, or you're too this to be that, or whatever. And I get that quite a lot, but I get even more othered now as a wheelchair user. Heck, I was in an airport 3 weeks ago, and the staff member went to my husband and went, can she walk? I was there. I was sitting there, but the lady didn't talk to me. The lady talked to my husband, and I got very, very annoyed and spoke my mind. But the thing is, there is still a general othering taking place. And when you have an othering, you have automatic fear around how to interact with that community. We still don't have enough disability representation in the media. And how often is the disabled or the neurodiverse person the evil person, the awkward person, the mean person in the media, right? It's still othering. Or you have this whole thing about the disabled person's either Paralympian or the scrounger. They're never a normal person just trying to get on with their lives. Or they're very rarely the person trying to get on with their lives. And as a consequence, that's furthering that othering that's taking place. And I think that's just feeding into employment.
No, absolutely. I think all those things absolutely count in terms of, again, the messages that we're sent constantly about, the limits within certain communities, whether it's people who've got disabilities, whether it's due to gender identity, no matter what it is, it's still there. So I suppose in terms of actually tackling that, it's doing something intentional to counterbalance that. I think role models are really important. But like you said, just having conversations and making that the norm, particularly with line managers, because I think that can be a really key interface for people within employment that would, the relationship with their manager, their ability to be open and be supported, it can tend to be a reason why they would either leave the workplace or continue in it. So I think that education piece is super important as well on top of that.
And I think there's so many good things. Like I remember one conversation with a new manager I had a few years ago. And the first conversation was, I know you have a disability. Are your adjustments being met? Do you know? And I was like, great, I didn't have to ask in the first place because it was automatically dealt with. Mm-hmm. And I feel like this should be a day one conversation for everybody, regardless of whether they declared a disability. Just make it normal. How many people do we still have taking sick days due to mental health conditions, hiding it as a backache or headache or a stomach ache, right? And that could be anxiety or a medicalized mental health condition. Like it could be any of, really badly spoken, but any of the list of mental health conditions that can happen. Yet they come into work and they go, no, I had a headache, I had a backache or whatever, because there is so much stigma around that. Yet fastest growing disability at the moment is mental health.
So absolutely.
Dealing with it, and people aren't feeling confident to come in and say, hey, I had a really bad mental health day because I was really anxious about something, or hey, no, my medication, I've just started on a new medication and it's not suiting me at all, for instance, and I'm still struggling with it. And, or I just needed some time out because I was really feeling not well. But if that's happening, then how are we going to make progress? It's about enabling those conversations. Something I really want to trial out in my workplace is actually day one conversation on everybody who comes back in from being sick, is providing them with the support for mental health, regardless of the reason they're coming back sick for. Because if we do it for every single sickness across the whole agency, every time, then it's just a normal conversation. We're no longer automatically, we're just doing it regardless of what the reason is.
Yeah. And then it becomes embedded as part of that practice.
It becomes embedded and it becomes normal. And then people go, hey, this is a conversation I have to have every time. No, this is just a signposting you're getting every single time you come off sick. We're sending it to you anyway, just in case. And that means it becomes a normal conversation. I'm trying to force that to happen. And that can be line manager led.
Absolutely. Love that. No, I think that whole kind of normalizing what we're all going through is so important. I think particularly post-COVID, one thing that I used to do years ago when I was feeling like I couldn't go into work, it wasn't a physical thing, it was more of an emotional thing. I'd kind of grant myself a wellbeing day, and I would love to see organisations start actually, using that terminology and, acknowledging that people have lots of things going on in their lives, and sometimes having that break really can help someone to be able to continue with work rather than them then kind of going down into a different situation. So I think terminology is really important, and practices as well. So again, lots of practical things that you're offering us today. So we're going to be wrapping up in just a few minutes, but I would love to just hear a bit more from you about your paraclimbing, because we haven't talked too much about that. And I know your husband's involved in that as well. So I'd just love to find out from your perspective what that's about, and how that's also supported you in terms of what you do in your day job around resilience and achievements.
So paraclimbing is quite literally something I fell into, and that's a bad pun for climbers because climbers fall all the time. I fell into after I'd had cancer, because the cancer treatment impacted my left arm, and then I don't really have a full right arm. It impacted things like my personal independence, so washing my hair, socks, putting my socks on, stirring things in the kitchen when I'm cooking and things like that. So real problems around that. And one of my best friends suggested I try climbing, and I sort of had been on a climbing trip with her when we were 8, when we were on a school trip, and she became a climber, I didn't. And the whole thing was, I sort of said to her, look, I've had a few years of being very unwell. I'd had multiple surgeries for several different reasons. And then the cancer had happened. My body shape has changed. I had a really poor image of myself. I'd become sedentary, and therefore my body was reflecting that. I was very not confident. She sort of said, look, what's the worst that can happen? The worst is you don't like it. The best is it changes your life. Couldn't argue with that. Really, really good thing to say for her. And I went, hated it because it was really painful. But I loved the mental escape I had when I was doing it, because for me, the focus of trying to move on the climbing wall, the coordination, the balance, different things required meant I got to forget that I was ill. And it's that feeling that makes me go back to climb all the time. And then I moved to London in 2013, and I really didn't climb for 2 years after that, and I was only climbing, as a hobby once every few months, nothing major. Then I found out about competitions in 2015, got a coach in 2016, and just started ranking in the UK. Was ranked second in the UK by the end of that year. I thought it was a fluke because imposter syndrome was rife. So I decided to recompete the next year and did the same things. It turns out it wasn't a fluke. Met my husband that year. He was also competing. He'd had a brain injury 10 years prior. So he's also a paraclimber. And so we've both been basically jumping on international teams. It's fundamentally, my climbing wall's in the office as well. I've got one in my house. It fundamentally changed our lives. It's a great sport. It's yet a sport I've not seen anybody who can't climb. We found a way to get anybody on the wall, including quadriplegic people with severe learning disabilities. We've yet to find anybody who we can't at least get onto the wall for an attempt. So it's more inclusive than swimming, I would dare say. And we know how inclusive swimming is as a sport.
Wow.
It is fundamentally an individual sport, but also a team sport in the sense that you have all the peer support from people around you. And it is something where everybody can share. And there are so many different types of routes available on any given day at a climbing wall that it doesn't matter how your day has gone, what's going on in your life. You can just go there and you might have changed, but the wall will not judge you for who you are. And that's what I love about climbing. The wall remains the same. It's only you who changes, and how you climb changes. So for me, when I go there, I can just be me.
Yeah, love that. Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. So inspirational. It's making me want to get on a wall now and climb it and have the challenge. But thank you so much, Anoushe, for your time and for your energy and for giving us such an insight, not only in terms of your personal experience, but those practical tools that you're able to share with us around how workplaces can really make things more inclusive. So thank you so much for joining us. Thanks everyone for joining us in today's session as well. This is our last session of the year, but we'll be back in 2023. So yeah, we will see you then, and I hope everyone has a lovely rest of the day. Thank you, everyone.